Senator O'Sullivan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Deputy President, and I rise to make a contribution to the debate on the Social Services Legislation Amendment Number 2 Bill 2015. Whilst I have an interest in all aspects of this legislation the amendments are associated with, one of my primary interests is the impacts that this policy and this legislation has had and is continuing to have on our Indigenous communities. My home state of Queensland, of course, has quite a number of Indigenous communities spread all over the state and in some particularly remote parts of the state. And some of the challenges that confront those communities, while similar, can be somewhat magnified or exacerbated given the remoteness of some of our communities and the challenges that generally face people in those communities on a day-to-day basis. I've spoken in this place previously of a number of recent visits that I've had to the community on Mornington Island, which is in the Gulf of Carpentaria, off to the northern part of Australia. And whilst I have moved around our Indigenous communities and have done so all my life in various forms, I was taken back by the circumstances that confronted the people, the 700 plus residents of that community, predominantly Indigenous islanders. One of the telling tales, which will lead me into the core of my contribution here, had to do with, on the day of my second visit that we departed, I had dealings there with a number of professionals and social workers who are involved in the delivery of social services and justice issues on the island. And I learnt that in the weekly appearance in that court, there had been the collective number of residents had faced over 200 offences, crimes and misdemeanours and simple offences. And just think about that. The entire community population is less than 1,000, yet there were 200 charges amortised across that community in just a 7-day period. And as I left, the telling sign was there was a significantly sized charter aircraft there, of course, to take away any people who had been given custodial sentences. Whilst we all support the fair, reasonable application of law, there are circumstances that present in these communities that would seem to expose people to behaviour on a scale relative to their population that we don't experience elsewhere. And the removal of people who are given custodial sentences completely out of their community. It's not simply a case of a son or a daughter or nephew or niece having been sent to jail for a week or a month or 12 months, where you can go down and continue to give them that family support. These people are removed from the community thousands of kilometres away to take up their time. And it is a really telling indictment, I think, on the society of Australia that we still have factors of this scale in these communities. Now, as I delved into the reasons for that behaviour, we were to learn that it was pretty well the typical things one might expect to see when looking at the data. Writ large, of course, was alcohol abuse, and I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. Evidence of illicit drug taking and the impacts that had, gambling, and to a much lesser extent the use and distribution of pornography. Now, coming back to the alcohol abuse issue, it is a matter accepted by many who live in these communities and by the work that's been done in terms of the social sciences, that many of these people have a much lower tolerance to the use of alcohol, in that it has an effect on their behaviour a lot sooner than one might expect when looking at the average capacity of an average Australian to be able to consume alcohol without it necessarily having these behavioural impacts. The other thing that was quite noticeable, of course, was the age bracket. The abuse of alcohol on this island and in many of our Indigenous communities and in poorer sections, poorer socio-economic sections of our general communities, it seems that the abuse of alcohol has no respect for the age of the people who are involved, and there is ample evidence to show that children as young as 9 or 10 have from time to time consumed alcohol and been affected by it to the point where their behaviour caused them to be involved in with acts or omissions that attracted these legal proceedings that I've made early reference to. Now, this is an island where the sale or possession of alcohol is prohibited. I'm not just concentrating on this island, but the concentration of these problems, the problems that give rise to the need for the type of legislation that we're debating here, were so much more acute, so much greater as a percentage of whole, that it is useful as a case study to make the argument for the legislation that we talk about here in terms of being able to manage, or for these people to be able to manage their income arrangements. So what we found was that the alcohol was being manufactured illicitly on the island and then sold, of course, at very inflated prices without any regard whatsoever to who the buyer or consumer of the alcohol may be. We're also seeing, of course, an increase in the manufacture of methamphetamines and in particular ice in many of these communities. Again, things that require money and resources to be able to establish in the first instance, and then are sold to people who have an addiction at quite inflated prices. Gambling, to a lesser extent, was a problem on this island, but is very evident in many of the communities around the state, and particularly, again, to the extent that it impacts on Indigenous populations of those in some of the metro communities. But a point made by Senator Xenophon, a very important point, is oftentimes we ignore the fact that these issues in their lives are as the result of addictions. And many of these people can't control what they do, or those who can obviously choose not to. But one thing that was common as I moved around this community and many other Indigenous communities in my time here and before was when one looks at what we might regard as the essentials or necessities of life, there is a serious body of evidence that these are the first things to suffer, particularly in buying good quality quotas of food for a family, clothing, the impact it has when they don't have the capacity to deal with costs associated with their housing or accommodation, and indeed the general utilities of life. Now, what we have is quite an abnormal situation in many circumstances, and the ones who clearly suffer the most are the younger generation within these communities, the children, even to the point where they are infant children. And many of the responsible parents, notwithstanding their efforts, find it very difficult to manage this circumstance because they may have not just one other person in the household who abuses alcohol and or drugs, but they oftentimes can have multiple adults who are in the business of abusing these things. In fact, there was evidence that entire households can, in one form or another, suffer from addiction in one or more of the areas that I have discussed. And so what you have is, as is the case, a very powerful strength in these communities, and one that we can learn from, of course, is the network that happens within families. And indeed, it's very common for the burden of childcare to fall upon a relative or a community leader, and where they might find themselves, as they've deposed to me on my visits, they could find themselves with 15 or 20 children seeking refuge in their home, looking for food and these essentials and necessities of life, where, if not provided by these relatives or social workers or teachers and educators in the communities, these children would be left quite literally to perish. Quite literally to perish. And so where you have a situation where the adults, the people who receive the money, who are meant to provide these essentials of life, these food and clothing and protection with our housing and their utilities, where they don't, and there's evidence that they don't, and as far as I'm concerned, any responsible government, and we are a responsible government, has a complete duty of care to do whatever it can do to assist these families in these plights to manage their lives. Now, it's well known that in many of these communities we have serious financial illiteracy. There's evidence that people can dispose of the entire income to a household within the course of that one day without having any regard whatsoever to what happens on the other 6 days of the week before they're returned into a position of having the financial capacity to deal with these essentials in life. And so in those circumstances, it's not just a case of children going with a hungry belly or not being able to go to school because they don't have the appropriate clothing or capacity to get from A to B for a day or two. This can go on for an entire week, and where these problems are systemic in those households, of course, they can go on for weeks and months, and for some families, sadly, tragically, it can go on for a lifetime. So these income-managed funds prevent at least a large part of the income being spent for these illicit purposes, and creates an environment where the money can only be expended on those essentials and necessities of life that I managed to describe to the chamber earlier. The trials with respect to this income management scheme have proved effective, in effect allowing the management of what I might refer to as forced budgeting, in a sense that that portion of your money can only be spent on these particular categories. Now, a very substantial number of people, including some of the people who have been involved in the scheme, including the social workers who are at the coalface day in, day out supporting these families, including the community leaders, and the peer-reviewed research that's occurred on behalf of the government to see that this scheme is operating, has reported. And on the material available to me, it would seem that a substantial number of the people have declared that this program makes their lives easier. These are people who've participated or observers to the impacts of this policy setting, that it makes life easier. It allows people to manage their money, be it still in short calendar timeframes. It makes these people feel safer. Now, that's a very important statement. It doesn't just fill their belly. It doesn't just put food on the table. It doesn't just put clothing on their back. It makes many in these communities feel safer. And I expect that that comes in part from the normality that's restored, at least in part, to some of these households and homes, because they have an ability to deal with the basic management of their financial affairs on the essential aspects of their lives. And to a person, it would seem they all reported that it improved their lives. Now, we talked before briefly, Mr Deputy President, about the fact that many of these homes and many of these families impacted on alcoholism, which can lead to domestic violence, and indeed makes a contribution in a more general sense into community violence. And so what we have is a situation where, even if there is a responsible adult in a cohort, in a family situation, they don't always, even if they had the capacity, they don't always have the ability. They don't always have the ability to be able to manage the finances of that household and to be able to make provision for the things that we have discussed here in the contributions today. So, accordingly, trials and policy settings of this type are needed to bring stability back into these homes. They're needed as tools for the responsible adults to be able to manage the households and make that journey towards normality. It reduces neglect, it reduces homelessness where people are displaced as a result of the circumstances of their living circumstances. And what we've had universally is child protection staff now reporting on the need to continue to adopt this particular scheme. Now, I was very pleased to hear Senator Xenophon, as he made his contribution, reporting to the chamber that this bill has been carefully considered. Now, Senator Xenophon doesn't agree with the government all of the time, and in effect, I think that his words of wisdom should cause others to consider what has happened here. He has reported, and I am prepared to report, that the government has very carefully considered these measures. It's not as if we're into greenfield ideas here. These ideas have been in our communities working very successfully now for a long period of time, and this is about extending what appears to be, insofar as it impacts on the income management side of things, to be a very successful program. There are incentives involved. As you know, Mr Deputy President, the legislation provides for match savings. So these are additional incentives, not only for these families to manage their money in a way to manage their financial, it's there to provide them with incentives to be able to put away some money for that rainy day circumstance. It quarantines 70% of the income, which ought to reflect the cost of living where they are. And I think the most telling point, and the one that if it's ignored by those in this chamber, then they no longer will be able to declare that their position reflects the position of the people who have benefited from this, where over 2/3 of the people who had been put on the scheme volunteered to remain on the scheme. Now, we had a contribution made earlier about listening. Well, you need to pin your ears forward as I say it one more time. 2/3 of the people, don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, Senator. 2/3 of the people who've been on this scheme have continued on the scheme on a voluntary basis. And if you want to go, through you, Deputy President, Senator, if you want to make your contribution in contradiction of the contributions made by people like Noel Pearson, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have a deaf ear to you and 2 ears faced towards North Queensland while I listen to that community leader. He's no friend of the government on every occasion. I promise you that. If Noel Pearson's got something to say, he has a complete disregard for the political identity of those on the other end of his sharp tongue. And if he supports it, and 2/3 of the people support it, then I commend to this chamber that we support